In 2018, he served as the chairperson for a year for the Center for Leadership and Civil Society. In 2020, he was one of the leaders and founders of the opposition Tigray Independence Party in Ethiopia, alongside his involvement in social and conventional media in the Tigray region on political commentary and analysis. Mahari has been a prominent youth leader, known for his fearless opinions and criticism of both the government and the TPLF party ruling in Tigray. During the war, his civilian political career was interrupted. After November of 2022 and the Pretoria peace deal, he left Ethiopia and lived in India until June 2024 before coming to Harvard. He'll be talking about the war as a lesson for the rest of Africa, thinking about the ethnic dimensions and the genocidal patterns. And then finally, just behind me, Professor Patrick Vink is a researcher and practitioner whose work focuses on the social and behavioral dimensions of health, human rights, and conflict, with a particular emphasis on transitional justice and reconstruction in the aftermath of war and other emergencies. Over the past 2 decades, he's worked with communities affected by armed conflicts throughout the world, including more than 25 countries, where he combines field research with support for recovery and resilience efforts. His work also explores the responsible use of digital tools to improve the delivery of aid and humanitarian assistance. In addition to his fieldwork, Patrick advises international and multilateral organizations on strategy development, monitoring, and evaluation. With Fong Pham, he is the co-founder of Kobo Toolbox, the world's leading digital data collection platform, and the think tank Data Pop Alliance. He currently serves as the research director for Harvard's incredible Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and is an associate professor in the School of Public Health. He will be closing out our initial panel conversation on post-conflict reconstruction and insights for Ethiopia's transitional justice prospects. After we hear brief remarks from all of the speakers on their own areas of expertise, we'll open it up to the audience for questions and further discussion. So please join me in welcoming our incredible panel. Abadir, why don't we start with you and the framing of the context. How did the conflict come to be, and what have been the consequences politically?
I have one. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Zoe. So in order to contextualize, Ethiopia is a stone nation. So I have to have, and I do that in Ethiopia has had a state of one or another continuously for 3,000 years is the number that's that's thrown out, which is not inaccurate. And in that period, Ethiopia has been a strong regional power, and it has been a weak local power through time. So if you go to the Aksumite Empire, you have an Ethiopia that is strong, that was controlling the Horn of Africa and Southern Arabia. Those of you who are familiar with Islamic history or the Quran, for example, will know the Surah Al-Fil, which is an example of the Ethiopian Empire reaching out to Southern Arabia. And it has been a weak power to the point where it has, for a couple of hundred years, had not had a capital city and had Roman kings who go around collect taxes. But Ethiopia has continued as an entity throughout that period. And in that period, there are times that the Ethiopian state has collapsed near completely, between, for example, the Aksumite and the Zagwe dynasties. And there are times it was weak and invaded, including by colonial powers. The reason I bring this up is to come back to the contemporary Ethiopia, to say that Ethiopia is at a turning point. And in 2018, it was in an interest period where it was becoming a regional hegemon. And let me also add, in this setting, whatever I'm going to say about Ethiopia, it should also be set in a context of regional geopolitical powers. Whether it's the Roman Empire, or it's the Islamic Empire, or the Cold War, or contemporary multipolar setting. I won't talk a lot about that, but that's always relevant and very relevant in the Tigray context as well. So in that setting, if we imagined Ethiopia in 2018 and imagined it to have a certain power structure, the state having been established on a certain distribution of power, distribution of resources, that was controlled by the EPRDF. That power structure was also justified by some discursive sphere known as revolutionary democracy. It's legitimated that power structure as one, as a developmental state, and two, as a nation of the country of the nation's nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia. Now, the Ethiopian government was having an issue in terms of, first, the government had established a power structure which excluded significant polities in Ethiopia. And the legitimating discourse worked for some elite groups in Ethiopia in terms of the nation's nationalities and people's discourse worked very well in the 90s, but was working less and less in the 2000s because a lot of the ethnic group-based elites were feeling disenfranchised, were feeling excluded from power and economic resources. And Ethiopia also had an Ethiopian nationalist elite that had been excluded since the 90s. And the discourse of nations and nationalities wasn't working in including the ethno-nationalist elites. Simultaneously, the Ethiopian state was based on the notion of developmentalism. And that was really at the core of Ethiopia in terms of the government was offering to its people a political settlement in which you had jobs, you had job security, homes, some economic support from the government, and instead you basically have allegiance to the government. You don't oppose the government because the government is providing you with economic development. That was the political settlement in 2018. However, although Ethiopia was increasingly becoming a strong economic power in the region, it was facing significant economic challenges. And it was really that the government's inability to distribute rent that leads to the 2018 transition. Rebellion in the Oromia region and rebellion inside the EPRDF itself is what leads to a palace coup that brings about the transition. Now, although the economy was becoming weaker or not sufficient to bring Ethiopia together, there were also strengths. Ethiopia was very strong in the coercive sphere. It had a very strong, the Ethiopian government had a very strong grip over coercion. And it didn't have any significant competitors, even in the region, let alone inside Ethiopia. And the other strength of Ethiopia at that moment was that the elite was cohesive enough that, think about Ethiopian history, think about 3,000 years. The difficult moments in Ethiopia are in overlap with transitions of power. In the imperial regime, you had a system that worked. 1974, Ethiopia almost collapses with the Derg revolution, but doesn't. 1991, something similar happens, where the transition in government was a complete change of government, military, bureaucracy. It was a complete replacement. And those were moments of instability. In 2018, we already had two handovers of power, especially the handover of power to Abiy was a moment that gave a lot of people hope, because you had a government in power give up power to someone they thought they trusted. And that was an important moment. And unfortunately, the Tigray war was a situation in which the government no longer has coercive control over the country. Its economy is not strong anymore. There isn't a distribution of power and distribution of resources in the country that is accepted by anyone, to a point where the Ethiopian government is losing significant territory. It doesn't control Tigray, it doesn't control parts of Amhara, it doesn't control parts of Oromia. So it's losing power, it's not collecting taxes. There are significant powers in Ethiopia that are fighting it because they don't feel represented, because they don't feel safe. They don't feel safe with the government unless they're armed. And so to summarize, if you looked at, let me use a figure of speech. If I view Ethiopia as a boat in 2018 that is on the edge of a waterfall, and the different parties inside that boat are rowing away from the waterfall. Some are rowing towards the waterfall, some are rowing towards one bank, some are rowing towards the other bank. No one is working together, and we were slowly headed towards the waterfall. That's a good analogy of the instability Ethiopia was in. And the Tigray war, you can imagine it as Ethiopia falling over the waterfall. And we know it has fallen over. We don't know if it will emerge, how it will emerge. In the next 10 years, Ethiopia could completely collapse. Of course, continuity might be there in terms of, after 3,000 years of history, you don't have a state just disappear. However, it could be in a situation where it looks more like the age of the empires, the Zamana Masafint could be what's ahead of us, or even a complete collapse in which you have different splinter groups. Don't forget 1991 to 94, Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia. That was one small breakup of Ethiopia. There could be more breakup, or it could be a complete collapse. I don't think we know what's going to happen, but it doesn't look good.
All right, I'd like to pass it next to Michael. We keep our presentation sufficiently crisp, if that's okay, so that we stay in time for discussions. Were we able to get the slides up?
Yes, I have hers. Do you have a presentation as well?
Yeah. Okay, bear with us. It might just take a moment. I appreciate the provocative introduction. I will say, being in Addis in February, it doesn't feel like it's on the brink of collapse, right? And that's part of the experience of fragmentation, is that you can be in the center of power, and it's the diplomatic capital of all of Africa. Everyone's convening for the African Union Summit, and there's quite a lot that's working. And then there are other parts of the Ethiopian state where things are very much not working, as one would hope. And the conversation is, how do we correct it so that it is actually a cohesive whole? Exactly. You can't hear. I apologize. We'll project. Do these only collect audio? They don't amplify?
They're for streaming.
Okay, so we don't have amplified sound. I apologize. We'll speak up.
Yes.
Thank you. This one. Oh, this one is on. So maybe we'll get the handheld. Hold on a second. If we use this, is it interfering?
For you, you need to. Okay, let's do it.
Does it interfere with
You
your
need to speak in both.
streaming?
You need to speak in both because
Okay.
otherwise.
Well, I just want to pass
Yeah.
the, so I can go like that.
Let me do this. Let me, yeah. Actually, for you, because this one is gonna go for the audience. So I think you can
Okay.
for you.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. We have a very high-tech team with us, so we don't usually operate this way. Michael, over to you, and I'll pass that.
We go now the slides up there.
They're here.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I guess you can hear me better now. My background is a bit different. I'm the outsider here, I would say. Obviously not Ethiopian. But my experience with the war has been precisely from a distance. Recurring, do I have a clicker or something, Ben?
I think just circle.
Yeah. Yeah, feel free to change the slide. My sort of background to this is as a political scientist who's trying to understand what the Tigray War is an example of in terms of how humans fight each other, basically. I'm a conflict scholar. I'm trying to understand broader patterns of history. It just so happens that Tigray, for a lot of different reasons, became a case that I was heavily involved in. When we think about how wars are recorded in the modern era, there's a fundamental problem here in that our attention towards conflict globally is extremely uneven. As you know, the Tigray War was 2020 to 2022. Compare that to the attention that the Ukraine war got, you know, it's nothing in comparison. The exception is that the news reported on several big massacres, for example, the massacre in Maikadra. But as a whole, the conflict is essentially a black box for most outsiders, and that includes for a lot of NGOs, especially when the war was ongoing, but also in hindsight. And that means, especially when it comes to questions of restorative justice, there's very little to build on in essence, because we don't have sort of cold hard facts, and that's something that's very rare in conflict. So if you see the PowerPoint there, estimates of the number of deaths range from 160,000 to 600,000. If you look at the big conflict data sets, so the reason why conflict data sets are important are because those are one of the main ways in which the impact of conflict is recorded. It's not just a small obscure political science thing. And the death tolls in the big political science conflict data sets says 2,600 and 7,000. So basically, our knowledge of how these wars unfolded is extremely lacking. And that is a problem because our sort of collective memory of how wars unfolded, of the tragedies that happened, is just uneven. Next slide, please. The reasons for this unevenness is a lot of things, including sort of, in the Tigray context, obviously the government shut down the internet, and that made a massive difference in terms of keeping data from leaking. But there's a range of reasons, including that African conflicts in general just receive less attention than the conflicts in Europe, for example, including Ukraine. Next slide, please. So as an example of the work I've been doing, so that's obviously a map of Tigray. The red dots there are the dots, they represent one of those data sets that I talked about. So on paper, our existing knowledge of how the war unfolded is essentially reflected in that map there. That denotes where all the big massacres and battles occurred. Next slide, please. The blue dots there are essentially my work. Some of those are duplicates, but essentially each blue dot represents a settlement, a village, or a town that's been burnt down, either completely or partially. And what you'll see there, that wasn't done. What you'll see there, if you compare the distribution of the red dots and the blue dots, not just that there's way many more blue dots, meaning that we severely undercounted how dramatic the war was or its consequences. But also we've missed one of the most crucial dimensions of the war, which is that the western Tigray was annexed. And that's the heavy concentration of blue in the west there is essentially that. Next slide, please. So the way I'm trying to sort of go about this is building on existing theories of political science, which have very little to say about this, to be honest. to answer the question of what was the logic or the pattern of settlement destruction during this conflict. And I focus specifically on settlement destruction because counting the number of deaths during a conflict is extremely difficult. It's an exercise that is built on a lot of speculation. But settlement destruction is something I can measure from the sky. Thank you. I'm not done. I'm at the next slide. Thank you. Just to say as well that, we can come up with lots of different explanations. Short-range explanation can include, maybe all of this was just a matter of armies looting and a lack of discipline, or Eritrean troops especially, they don't receive salaries, so they live off the land essentially. Their salary is what they loot. But longer range theories instead look of sort of, was it systematic, was it opportunistic? Next slide. And the big tools I rely on is fire data, which is open source through NASA. It's called BEERS. And the second is satellite imagery in the form of Sentinel-2 and even Google Earth, actually. Next slide. All right, I'm going to show you some examples now of what this looks like in practice, and I hope this is visible to you. So here's an example of a refugee camp that was inhabited by Eritreans primarily, or exclusively, I guess. This is before. And next slide, please. The Eritrean troops emerge into the camp around this age. It's visible between, can you skip and go back and forth between the two? You see the changes here are essentially scorch marks in that settlement. And then if you jump to the next slide, the entire thing is gone. The exception is a few select buildings that were used as warehouses by EDF troops. Thank you. Here's an example of a different pattern of violence. This is Alameda textile factory. And if you go to the next slide, the textile factory was damaged because it was looted. But if you look at the buildings around, most of them are still intact, which shows that this wasn't one of the cases of sort of genocidal violence. It was rather an example of looting. Next one. Here, however, here's one of those towns in western Tigray. So this was a town near Dansha Airport. Most of those houses you see there are regular homes, regular peoples, civilians. And if you go to the next slide, most of those civilian homes were systematically targeted house by house. So if you set one house on fire, the fire might spread a little bit. But if you you can analyze the scorch marks, how the scorch marks spread. And one pattern that often pops up is that scorch marks started at several separate points, which indicates that it wasn't just, for example, a wildfire that brushed over the entire thing. Rather, several separate ignition points were started, which indicates something systematic. And one thing, do you see the square building somewhere to the north there? It's a bit outside of the town. One thing that's interesting is in this context, places of worship are really easy to detect because they have either round or square roofs. In a lot of these cases, they actually preserved the places of worship. There are cases where Eritrean troops especially attacked places of worship. Amharic troops, they tended to preserve them, possibly to use them for their own purposes. That's also why you see some preserved houses there. And this one is very quick. There's two concentrations of settlements on those mountains. This is essentially in the middle of nowhere. It's extremely hard to get there. There's no highways. Next slide. Those have been completely wiped out. And one theory here is that it's a strategy to force civilians to move into urban areas where they're easier to control, and also to remove the possibility of TPLF relying on rural mountain communities to wage a guerrilla war, essentially. And then the last, And here's another one of a very sparsely populated rural area. And what these houses are I can't know 100% certain, but I think most of them are sort of, these are farming communities. And you see these houses, which are very scattered, are surrounded by hedges, presumably to keep livestock, right? And if you look at the next slide, all of those hedges are gone, and so are the houses. And that's one example of food being used as a weapon. I'm done in a second. I don't know how much time I have left. But I've been also talking to colleagues, and it's a pattern I've seen myself. It's just something that's harder to document systematically. Is that crops were systematically torched. Old areas, for example, next to the Tekeze River, which are very fertile, and Western Tigray in general is a very fertile area, lots of parts of it at least, which the Tigrayan population have been dependent on, are lost, right? And that's how we got the massive famine, and the Tigray is still completely dependent on humanitarian aid. All this to say that this wasn't just some, you can go to the final slide now, thank you. What I'm doing here is to say, like, I'm separating out the explanations that this was just, you know, looting or armies that run amok. Rather, we're seeing something here that's very systematic. An army doesn't go into a random mountain village in the middle of nowhere and destroy everything, you know, if it's just an army that's looting. It's something that's more systematic. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe before we pass the mic, can you just clarify on the Western Tigray displacement? Was that also the TPLF stronghold, or was the TPLF based in the east?
I mean, the TPLF controlled all of Tigray before. The Western Tigray is a bit strange because it's the Amharic militias claim that those areas were historically Amharic areas, and they decided to sort of rectify that by ethnically cleansing those areas. If it was a stronghold for the party, I don't think so. Not in terms of sort of manpower or anything, but yeah.
We'll go next to Burhan to talk about a different hidden violence. I think now we've seen like the war on the landscape and the people through the landscape. Burhan will talk about the landscape of the body.
I need this?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's not interesting presentation, so bear with me. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having me. For the sake of the time, I'm just gonna focus on the dimension of the sexual violence in the Tigray war. So this conflict results more than 600,000 civilians, and within only the first year, let's say 8 months, 120,000 women were subjected to sexual violence. So, given the limited time that I have, I will focus only the pattern of this weaponized rape during the war. So based on my findings from my field research and interviews with several survivors of sexual violence from the different geographic area, including the Western Tigray and from the Eastern and from the southern part of Tigray, the key patterns was the sexual violence was very systematic and coordinated across multiple perpetrators, including Eritrean, Amhara, and the Ethiopian federal troops. So despite operating in different geographic areas, the pattern was very similar, the target was very similar, and it was coordinated and systematic. And according to that, most of the cases that I found, as you can see in the pictures, these are paintings, but like they tell each stories that were documented in my book. So you can see three paintings here, but each of them have their own stories, and some painters helped me to paint the stories as a one picture to analyze a story. No, please back. Yes, thank you. So as you can see, most of the cases are gang raped within maybe 15 months in one incident. Several times these women were also subjected to multiple incidents and oftentimes in like sexual slavery for months. They were capturing and staying with them as a sexual slavery, using them as sexual slavery, and yeah. So I found this one pattern, and many women were publicly raped in community spaces, especially, and in marketplaces, and in house within family members. While see the family members is, if you can see in the third picture, there are children there who are seeing it's her children, they are her children, and they are forcefully to see the incident while she was forcibly raping and sorry, yeah. Anyway, and so most of the cases were involving family members, male especially, children's parents and grandparents, to forcibly to witness the incident also, or maybe in some parties to act the violence while the soldiers were looking the rape. And several survivors that I met, including this woman, and the next slide please. Thank you. Including all of these women, they were subjected to several internal injuries, including continuous vaginal bleeding and discharge of permanent and fistulas. As you can see in the middle of the picture, you can see 3 children. It's her children, and they were raping her, and they were also cutting her breasts so that she cannot feed the children. And on the third picture, you can see children and soldiers, so they were forcing her to rape her in front of her children. And so most of the cases also including virgin and young girls, to specifically to get impregnant with these different soldiers. Can you go back? Sorry. Yeah. So this woman in the third part, you can see she was pregnant, and they were using also some foreign objects to insert to the woman's body to distract the fertility and permanent injuries. So this woman recently have been died because of cancer, cervical cancer, due to the gang rape. And in the first picture, as you can see, she was subjected with sexual violence as a gang rape, and also she was subjected to the foreign subjects. They were inserting her womb with condoms and other foreign objects. So in the middle, as you can see, this following after that, many women also have been mentally ill and to psychosocial crisis, and some of them also made suicide, including the middle one. You can see she made a suicide after I met her, after like 6 months or so. Yeah. So in general, one pattern I found is like there were also targeted institutions like churches, mosques, and other institutions that family dependent. So as you can see, she's a monk in the first picture. She's 78-year-old. She never know a man in her life, but they were entered the church, and they took her and they raped her for 2 weeks, and after that she became HIV AIDS, and then she's mentally ill now. So you can see these patterns in several women. So it's like it's very, very similar. But what I found is like for these 3 perpetrators, even though they have like very similar target, they have also slightly different targets, I would say, because for the Eritrean soldiers, especially on the slurs and on the language they were using, the Amhara soldiers, they were using, we need to purify your blood, the Tigrayan blood, or either we have to mix it or we have to purify it. So most of the Amhara soldiers, they were trying to purify the blood with mixing, like with making pregnant, especially with young girls and middle-aged women. They were subjecting. With Eritrean soldiers, it's kind of, they were saying Tigrayan have to be eliminated. So they were not like with the women that I found, they were not intentionally doing like pregnancy. They didn't intend to force pregnancy. Rather, they were like, if they found a pregnant woman, they forced to remove the pregnancy with the Eritrean soldiers. With the Ethiopian troops, they were, especially those who are not from Amhara, they were focused on the disobedience of the Tigrayan, like for the central government, for the Abiy. It's like kind of a punishment community because of the disobedience. These are the patterns I found during my research, but if you have any.
The year 1890 as an important turning point was it's because since that year Ethiopia, Tigray appeared as a subjugated element. It turned from core to periphery because of that power shift in 1890, and that power shift was permanent, and central government Ethiopia was more or less dominated by the Amharas, and they have tried for 100 years to build a state based on one dominant ethnic group, and they were trying to import their language, their culture, and sometimes their religion, and then this was the cause for the ethnic wars, ethnic conflicts, or ethno-regional antagonisms in 1960s and 1970s, which gave birth actually to the TPLF. And TPLF, in alliance with armed ethnic forces, managed to dislodge the military junta, which was in power in Ethiopia starting from 1974 up to 1991. And after that period, TPLF being the core force in the new coalition, EPRDF tried to remake Ethiopia in a federal structure. But that federal structure was not democratic as it is written in the constitution. TPLF has never implemented the constitution throughout its 27 years of rule in Ethiopia. Rather, it was ruling Ethiopia based on the party guidelines, which they call revolutionary democracy. And it was obvious that one day such that type of regime will collapse, and obviously after the days of the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia Meles Zenawi, there was a power vacuum, and there were also hopes that reforms will emerge from somewhere within the party or from the public protests and public uprisings. Actually, as I was in Tigray and active in the civil society movements, I embraced the reform. I supported the calls of change from the youth in Oromia and Amhara. But I was hesitant about the nature and the path of the reform. Particularly, I was hesitant if the guy who emerged as a new leader of Ethiopia is going to lead Ethiopia into peace and harmony, or if the guy was in a position to just narrow down the ethnic tensions. Obviously, the PLF was not happy. They could not have actually, and they were trying to undermine the reforms from their new palace in Mala. And most of us were opposing such type of intimidations from the PLF against central government. But reform gone wrong, starting from the August 2018. Abiy was, or the current Prime Minister was trying to create new alliance, basically motivated by his narrow interests and his power struggle with the PLF. For example, the new regime has tried to reapproach with Eritrea. Well, that was fine. It was an interest of many of the Tigrayans to resolve the conflict with Eritrea, but the issue was not that. It was an whole alliance motivated by their desire to annihilate the TPLF. In fact, there were vendettas. Actually, it was a kind of alliance more or less designed to revenge against the TPLF, and the Amhara forces were also allying themselves with the central government. And for most of us who have been in Tigray, we were quite sure that something disastrous is coming to us, and because the claims of those forces within the new alliance under the leadership of President Isaias Afwerki and Abiy Ahmed Ali were not by any means or genuine or in whatsoever legitimate political claims. For example, there was an issue about the Western Tigray, and the Amharas just claim it as it was part of their historic territory. No, it was not part of their historic territory. They subjugated it in 1894. That means exactly after power shifted from Maqala to Addis Ababa. That means after the Amharas managed to control the central government in Addis Ababa and they have also some claims in southern Tigray, but it has never been part of the Amhara. They only took it in 1948. So, in one and the other way, the war or the motives of the war has nothing to do with the PLF. Rather, it was a kind of contention about ethnic identities, historical claims, as well as the assertiveness of the Tigrayans on their right for self-determination. This is my understanding. And about the course of the war, the atrocities committed throughout the process, Brahan was presenting well, and Mikhail's scientific observation is also very important. I don't want to repeat that, but I want to shed light on the current developments also. The way out, actually. I'm less optimistic that things will be solved peacefully. One thing is the nature of the regime in Addis Ababa. Another thing is the nature of regional politics in the Horn of Africa, because there are always alliance and counter alliance without principle, and these forces are more or less not shackled by whatever constitution or their national institutions. So the region is going through a very dynamic process of change, which is actually full of incompatible interests and antagonistic alliance and counter alliance. There is also forces which are highly involved in the mission of proxy war. And so I don't think that it's possible to hold the Ethiopian state unless something happens in the center and the social base of the current regime tries to rethink about its support for the current government. Thank you.
Patrick, we can present a Ethiopia-wide view of public opinion.
There you go. Thank you. It's complicated to follow my fellow speakers here. We've heard about the very complex rules and dynamics in Ethiopia. We've heard about the horrific crimes and violence that has taken place. What I'll be talking about is kind of the mechanism that we hope help break cycles of violence, so transitional justice, trials, truth commission, reparation, sets of mechanisms that, as I said, are meant to break cycles of violence. And what we found, looking at the practice of transitional justice globally, it works better when domestic trials are taking place and when there are reparations for survivors and the families of victims. But what does it mean for Ethiopia? And so our work across countries is to co-create mixed methods research that really engage people on the ground to try to understand what's their priorities, what have people experienced, what would they like to see happen in the future to build a more stable country, in this case Ethiopia. And what we've heard from Ethiopia loud and clear is that there is no pathway to peace without accountability. People want to see trials, people want to understand what happened, why it happened, and they want to see reparations for what happened. At the same time, there are quite diverging opinions as to how it needs to take place. Diverging opinions on the time frame. How far back do you look at? What episodes of violence do you look at? What territories are concerned? Geographically, what should be the focus of this mechanism? And what forms of justice, what jurisdiction does it take place? Is it purely domestic? Is it hybrid with including international role, or is it purely international? And you can imagine that respondents in Tigray have very different opinions than respondents in other parts of the country, and even of the country we see diverging opinions. So what does it mean? What do you do when you have this type of diverging opinion? On one hand, if you do too much, it's not possible. It's not possible to account for everything that has happened. There are just practical barriers, limitations in terms of costs, for example. On the other hand, doing too little, is going to create discontentment. Are these efforts going to be perceived as genuine, legitimate? If they are not, then you're going to create discontentment. And really, that's what we find. A competing environment, any programs that you build will be seen through a sectarian lens, through the lens of deep mistrust, deep mistrust in the judicial system. I'll leave time for questions, so I'll just talk fast forward what has happened. There is a transitional justice policy under development after consultation and range of process. We can talk of how that has taken place, but it is happening. And so what are some of the concerns? What are some of the opportunities here? One, of course, is that unlike many implementation of transitional justice, there's not really a transition, right? So there was a conflict, there's not really a transition, and now there's been a rather comprehensive approach that's being taken. But again, it means that it potentially will die as happened in Tigray, because you're going to focus on violence, and so it's kind of a way out to say, oh yeah, well, other things. And so what does it mean, the conflict of Tigray? What does it mean for the resources that are needed for this? Especially because we know this administration is not going to be pushing quite as heavily on those issues as previous administrations have in the US. Is there true political will? What does it mean for the institutions that are being designed right now? The plan is to have a of processes in parallel, including that will be granting amnesties and criminal prosecutions, but not really clear articulation of how these things are going to work together. What if the criminal prosecution is undermined by the granting of amnesties, which can be highly politically driven, of course, and so that will potentially severely undermine the process. There are ongoing human rights violations. So what do you do about that in the current process? And there are important restrictions on the ability of the civil society to voice their opinion, to advance some of these debates. So lots of questions, and it goes back to the issue of, is transitional justice in this context going to achieve anything, or is it just going to raise tension, raise expectation, but also create discontentment with the processes? I would say that the small optimistic part of me, as it looks like I have to bring some optimism to the debate, is that once you open the door to transitional justice, once these questions happen, once these issues are being discussed, it's really hard to close the door. And I would really encourage working with civil society, reaching out, public outreach, education around what is transitional justice, what is accountability, what can you expect, and really help raising a more informed demand for these processes. Independent monitoring of these processes will hopefully be a small contribution of trying to break those cycles of violence. But as my colleagues have said, it's extremely complicated in this context. So I'll stop here so we have time.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, thanks to the heroic efficiency of our panelists, for formal questions, and then we, of course, can stay and please continue to eat and have informal conversation. I'd like to open the floor to any questions from the audience who are present here. All right, we'll start with Yoshi.
Thank you very much for very insightful presentations and discussions. I learned a lot. And then I'd like to ask you a little bit about the current situation. I learned that the many civilians are actually victims. And then you may, Braham mentioned about those female victims as well. Are they getting any care, mental care? And then also, Patrick mentioned about the civil society, but what is the current situation of them? Are they actually working, or so I'd like to, if you can share current civilians' life and including education, health, and those stuff, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Maybe we can start with Braham and then Patrick.
Thank you for that question. It's really important to, after hearing these kind of situations, what's next, and for these women and girls, and including the men who are subjected to this, they're asking what's next, what's our next. So I would say to start healing or to start mental health support, it starts with recognition of pain. So it's not recognized yet with any parties or with any actors, including the Ethiopian government. I'm not claiming to to accept their crimes because they made it like systematically, but recognizing the pains is a moving forward for the, especially for survivors and victims. Apart from that, there are some here and there interventions, not full interventions, not holistic interventions, including until today there are women who have been subjected to this, suffering from chronic diseases. They're in hospitals, but there is no medical care that can give them for free, or because also they can't afford it. Mike was saying they were losing their homes, their assets. They don't have money to help themselves, let alone to do medication. They don't have anything to eat. So with the current funding situation, there is not much intervention, I would say. So we're losing many of our sisters and mothers, including in the mental health support. Many of them are like in developing PTSDs and more. But I think that the moving forward is recognizing these pains and to come to the transnational justice. The pain have to be recognized by these actors, or the world have to be forced to recognize this pain, I'd say.
Thank you. I will just mention two things. One at the low. What in Ethiopia we worked with a dozen universities. We interviewed more than 7,000 people around the country. That was just a little bit more than a year ago. I'm not sure we would be able to do that today. That I think speaks to the evolution and the challenges that are emerging globally. We're entering a more fragmented world. We're entering a world of democratic backsliding. So the space for civil society to do its work, the space for accountability is decreasing. And the space, frankly, for support for victims is decreasing around the world. And so providing the necessary services, not just justice, accountability, as you mentioned, mental health, reparation, those addressing direct basic needs is just getting more and more challenging. And so yes, it does not bring a lot of optimism as a question.
I'm going to ask two questions that were submitted in advance, and then we'll hand it back to the audience. And I think they're slightly related, but they're slightly different. So one of our participants asked, given the renewed tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia at the state level, with Tigray caught in the middle, what are the implications for Tigray and prospects for peace? And aside from the tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia, what was the nature of the peace deal that was signed? To quote the anonymous questioner, was it legit? Has the government followed up on its promises, such as resettling IDPs and restoring normalcy in Tigray?
Let me just pinpoint some ideas about the peace process, the peace agreement. It was unfair deal, but it was necessary because of the situations that were evolving on the surface of the world. But it had also a lot of opportunities and challenges. There was a narrow window of opportunity that could restore peace or that could sustain peace with that deal. But the government in Addis Ababa is not helpful for the peaceful settlement of the agreement and for the implementation of the agreement. Primarily, there are flaws on the terms of the peace deal, and it was also like a kind of overdose for PR profit. Like, how can you expect to demobilize an army of 250 or more than 170,000 troopers within 30 days, which is very less likely. But beyond that, if restoring to the constitutional order is the guiding principle behind the agreement, it should be implemented without precondition. And the territory subjugated by force in November 2020 should be restored to the constitutionally recognized regional state of Tigray. It never happened. Instead of that, in my opinion, the government is trying to manipulate the infightings between the political factions of Tigray. And the Ethiopian government has just a huge interest of controlling Tigray than recognizing it as an autonomous political entity within the state. Instead, the government seems to subjugate the region and dismantle its bargaining powers. So, for me, this is the main reason behind the stalemate on the implementation of the peace process and the alliance with Eritrea, with other regional forces, a byproduct of the stalemate. Alliance with Eritrea. Actually, Tigray is a regional state, and it's not legally acceptable for a regional state within a sovereign state to make alliance with a foreign government. But in the rule of the game of the Horn of Africa, it's possible. It's natural that neighboring countries, neighboring governments involve themselves in domestic affairs of other states. At the same time, the Ethiopian government is trying to help Eritrean opposition who stands against the Eritrean government, and as a reciprocity, it's obvious that the Eritrean government has an interest to support belligerent entities in Ethiopia. But the real thing is, such alliance will shift the power balance on the ground, and it will result in a devastating course unless the peace deal is implemented unconditionally. This is my perspective.
Thank you. Let's take our last two questions back to back, if that's okay, and then I'll give the last word to the panel. So we have one here and one at the front.
Sorry about that. Mine is a short comment,
Yes,
if I
please.
may.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a question in particular. With regards to the sexual violence that was presented by the speaker, methodologically, I think there are some flaws that one has to consider. Number one, why did the Eritrean government get engaged in the war is because about 20-21 missiles were launched without provocation against the Eritrean population in Asmara. And 120 places were actually targeted. These are civilian areas that were targeted by the TPLF. So it was in defense of our sovereignty and in defense of our territorial integrity that we got engaged. It wasn't to go there and then to violate, the rights of the population in Tigray, whether it's women and all that stuff. So that has to be put in perspective, I think. And the other thing is, we have to look at the history of how the current Eritrean government, as a PLF, during the liberation, movement, how did they treat the prisoners of war? There's ample evidence that it was very humane. So much so that some of them decided to stay in the field rather than going to Ethiopia and all that stuff. So if you look at the EDF, Eritrean Defense Forces, they are very disciplined, and that's how they acted. So it doesn't quite, represent what was actually going on in Tigray. And the other information now, even the former president of Tigray is saying that there are some questions about who did the now. And also how you went about collecting the data is by targeting certain populations and all that stuff. It's really sad that women were raped. There's no question about that. But who did it or not seems to be a bit biased the way that the research was done. That is my comment. In terms of the myth that the gentleman explained, I agree with the presenter that it's just a myth. You know, if we look at Ethiopia now, you know, sorry about that. Yeah, if you look at Ethiopia now, it's a failed state. You know, when one talks about Ethiopia, one has to ask the question, which Ethiopia? Are we talking about the Tigrayans? Are we talking about the Amharas? Are we talking about the Oromos? You know, and so on and so forth. So moving forward, if one has to actually promote real peace, we shouldn't go around trying to tarnish the fame or reputation of nations and all that stuff. We can just work together. My last question is about the places that you showed us. It's Mike, I think. You know, how can one discern whether it was the Eritrean Defense Force that did it, or the TPLF did it, or the Amhara did it? I mean, I think with confidence you say that probably the Eritrean force did it, but there's no evidence of that.
You assume that.
So,
Okay. Thank
I
you
mean,
so
one
much for
could
your
raise it.
intervention. I think those are three very provocative points. I just want to collect one more before we give it to the last word.
Say again, sorry?
I'll collect one more from the front and then we'll hand it back to the panel.
Thank you so much for lighting, actually. We learned a lot today. I just want to ask Dr. Ibrahim, maybe extend the previous questions about the relation between Eritrea and the neighbors.
I'm going to ask you to put the microphone right this way, live stream.
Egypt, Sudan, you know, the problem now in Somal, Eritrea, you mentioned some of it. The curse of geopolitics and how this affects even the divisions going on inside the Eritrea itself, how this reflects all that problem, foreign policy and internal policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we just go down the line, rapid fire? So don't answer everything, just answer the one that speaks to you.
Okay, geopolitics is important, not just in the context of Egypt and Sudan, Eritrea, but Middle Eastern countries are also in the fight, and that is destabilizing because it's difficult to build local consensus when you have an outsider who can veto the conversation that's going on. If a belligerent is losing steam and know that they can get funding from abroad, that can prolong conflict. And I believe to the extent that the whole region is, I think the whole Horn region is at risk of going towards a collapse kind of setting. Before I hand over the mic, I want to maybe say one more thing in terms of, maybe this is something I should have started with. As someone who's from Ethiopia, not from Tigray, I want to recognize the pain and suffering that victims have gone to, even if not directly victimized. When I look at these pictures and I hear the narratives, read about the narratives, the stories and the reporting, it's even I was starting to shake earlier just seeing the levels of violence, and I can't imagine how that would have felt if that was happening to family members and to people who look more like me, speak my language, so I just want to say that that even if the Ethiopian state is not going to recognize, and Patrick knows my opinion on this, I don't believe that they're interested at all in recognizing the violence that happened. I want, as an individual, to say that I, myself, including many other Ethiopians, do recognize the pain, do see the suffering, and do stand in solidarity with you. It's probably even if transitional justice doesn't happen, at least the least what we can do. And I want to also set an example to others in my position to say that we can at least recognize and personally approach victim groups and say that we see them and we hear their pain.
Thanks. Hold on. Yeah, thanks. Just on the comments that was said earlier, one thing that I think is really important to remember is the point here was made about what TPLF did or didn't do. It's kind of irrelevant because, at least for me, because the only thing I care about is were civilians impacted or not. Thing is, TPLF, several on the panel here are including opposition politicians against the TPLF, might disagree about like what the TPLF were doing at the time. Thing is, that does nothing to justify what was imposed on the Tigrayan people, like the extreme level of suffering that they went through. With regards to the question that was posed to me about who did what, well, we do actually know where the different armies operated. So we know that the Amharans were kept largely to the western Tigray. EDF was cutting through central Tigray and they left a trail of devastation that we know that they imposed. And if you're going to talk about, you said earlier that Eritrean troops were disciplined. In that case, that wasn't random, it was systematic, right? So that's my comment. I appreciate that. It's important to be nuanced in terms of what, of course, it's not like we can point fingers and say that Eritrea did everything, but I think minimalizing or trivializing the suffering that the civilians went through, that is something that is so, yeah.
I think for those of you who want to understand what really happened in the war, I think Badr is familiar with the New Line Institute report about the genocide in Tigray, which was published in June last year. I think that will be supportive. And I'm sad that by any means genocide should not be manipulated for any political reasons. It's a crime against humanity and it should be treated like that, whoever committed it. So I want to focus, I want just to pass a message about I don't think transitional justice is possible in Ethiopia, and I'm not quite sure also if it's possible to try perpetrators of genocide through transitional justice. I've tried to read some of the documents prepared by the government for transitional justice. They are taking it out of context. They want to just try all the crimes commissioned throughout the last 50 years. This is deflective, and the government is running away from accountability for me. And Ethiopia has not any political institution, impartial political institutions that can adjudicate crimes like genocide. I don't think it will be a feasible way, and there is a
complex and layered set of political conflicts that shape both what is possible and what people think possible. And I want to really thank and congratulate each of you for the empirical and objective approach that you're taking to what is such a fraught and contentious arena, trying to identify with satellite data, with ethnographic testimony, with political analysis, legal analysis, and nationwide opinion surveys, what people want, what they've experienced, what's next, is a huge service to the people of Ethiopia and to the government, diverse and oppositional as it is within itself, to really try to get to a new imagining of what's possible. And I think Ethiopian nation building has always been a nascent and kind of iterative process, much like nation building within the United States and elsewhere in Africa. And so thinking about transitional justice as not just a policy challenge, but also an inheritance for the next generation, I think is really important, and it's something I've taken away from this conversation. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you soon.